email with all your notes?
Yeah, I've got all the slides, the PowerPoint. So if you send me an email, then I can just send it back to you. There's let's see, there'll be 6 total after next week. So probably have to send it in a couple batches so it doesn't clog up your email. Yeah, yeah. If you send it, I can do that.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Let's see.
If you have more than $10,000 in the bank, don't notice. I guarantee you that you'll lose money. Real estate, the stock market, earning 5 to 7.
You know John Michael Talbot? Yeah, he's really great.
He hasn't many news stuff.
For a long time, I think. Yeah, I don't know what's happened to him. Hey, Dave.
Yo. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, little John Michael Talbot.
I love him. Great. Yeah. Have you been to his
Little portion?
yes,
I'm not, have you?
I haven't. A friend of mine used to go out there for 2 weeks of vacation every year. He'd go out there for 2 weeks and be a month every year.
Oh, wow.
Morning.
Well, I just read through the bulletin. So we were doing heavy duty grandparenting this week.
Yes.
So just read through the bulletin. Wow, 1892.
Something else, isn't it?
Yeah, no wonder that one only lasted 36 years.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, you know, the rubrics have changed slightly, or maybe they, I don't know, but everything actually, where it says minister, it's actually bishop. Because bishop, you know, the bit apparently.
Well, yeah, it's implied. So the bishop is the officiant, and then the priest is deputized.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Well, that makes more sense than I thought.
I never knew that. Really?
Yeah. So the real pastor of every parish is the bishop. And then he's the council of elders.
That makes sense.
Yeah. They were actually called presbyters instead of priests.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
I did, for Janice, asked me to, print out a little bit of a Eucharistic prayer that there is. It's not nearly as long.
So short.
But I printed that for her with some white space around it, so it'd be easier to read while she's.
And there's no fraction at all. It's just breaking. And he took the bread, and they take the paten, and he broke it, and then they break the bread right then and there.
Wow.
Hi, Gary.
Hi, Carrie. Good morning. I'm here music. Maybe it's from that.
Oh.
Stage chanting.
Yeah. You want to hear me again, Gary?
Yes. Are you singing? You and David Locke could do a show.
Morning, Jane.
Morning.
How are you doing?
How are you doing? Well, happy to be here. Yeah.
Good.
Another gorgeous day out there, that's for sure.
Dave, how's your son-in-law doing?
Well, he has his scan on, let's see, it's the 29th.
Tell me his name again.
Chris.
Chris.
Yeah.
So Wednesday?
Wednesday, so the 29th. And I think that's when they begin the chemo. So I guess they both start, they both happen then. But when they did the scan the last time of his lungs, he he didn't even want to see it. I didn't want to know what stage it was in, but my daughter asked the doctors. So we'll see how this goes. What's that? Yes. Yeah. Okay.
How are things with you, Terry?
Yeah, it might be a good idea if you have all the words to the song printed out, but sometimes Leon throws a few things in there.
This is where all the blue ones
Okay.
come. Music and church.
Yeah.
Hey, Valerie.
Sounds like it's never been.
I think you seem crispy.
Yeah. We're not using the 17 whatever.
Well, it's interesting too, they only do the epistle and the gospel. They didn't even, it said, at this time, the collect, the epistle, and the gospel will be read. So they never was an option for a song or something.
Huh. Well, they never put the Protestant into the Episcopal Church back then.
Yeah.
Well, that service must be a little bit longer then.
We read the whole Decalogue,
Yeah.
because we weren't sure how long it would take.
Yeah.
I bet we don't do it next time. So we'll try it, and if it's really long, then we'll know next time to
Yeah.
skip over. We may not do it at 10:30, because it's in there for 10:32.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do lunch, but at 10 minutes. The priest.
Did that last time.
Yeah, the priest says, thou shalt not, and we all say, Lord, have mercy.
We did that last time we did this.
I don't think we're gonna have music.
For anyone that's online, we're going to be starting a little bit late. The first service just ended, and then Leon, who's the organist, will be coming in to start the class. So we'll be starting probably 10 minutes late. So we'll be with you in a minute, though.
All right, well, have a fun day. Have fun at the farm.
knows, I think. 'Cause I wrote it on it just to remind her.
Thank you
Hi,
so
Dave.
much, Tom.
Where did she say was it?
What's the song today?
124. 124.
Okay.
Dave, I listened to this Bible in a Year with Father Mike Schmitz, is a Catholic priest,
Yeah.
and he's in the Psalms of Ascent right now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so it's kind of neat.
Yeah, well, what good timing.
Yeah.
Is it like a class thing?
What an operation.
He reads, it's 3 readings, he's taking his through the Bible in a year. I listen to it in the car.
Yeah.
Paul
And,
you know, Hollywood.
He reads all the readings and then he goes through and has a commentary about
You didn't hear a word of it.
each one of the readings.
Forgot
It's
about
very,
it.
very good, very thorough,
Say it like
and
that.
very well spoken. He's entertained, he's very entertaining.
Wow, I may need to check that out myself.
Yeah, Father Mike Schmitz.
Okay.
He's a priest up in Minnesota.
Okay. Is he at the University of Collegeville?
Yeah, he is.
Yeah, they're great. I've got one of their commentaries. And,
Yeah.
yeah, they're
In progress. He's said several times, but
a lot of scripture.
very, very energetic. I like him a lot.
That's Mike Schmidt. Okay.
Mike Schmitz, yeah.
Listens, he's on something that she did, it's a Halo or something, or some kind of, that has all different kinds of, they have like a novena.
Oh, you did?
On there, they have him, but they also have like novenas and what do you all different lines of organization, yeah.
Okay. Halo, huh? Check that out.
That might be how, I don't know, she was telling me about it, but I didn't actually see it, so.
Thank you.
Well, while we're waiting for Leon, we don't want to push it back too far. I'm just going to do the first part that I usually do about book recommendations. So, my favorite grandfather was named Waggy by one of my older cousins, and Waggy was a very devout Lutheran and spent a lot of time working with the church. When he died, this is what I inherited. It was a series of commentaries called the Layman's Commentaries. I got these when I was like, I don't know, 18. They're old. This is published in 1960. So it's not something you can rush out and buy, but they've updated the Layman's Commentaries. They're really nice. Everything's pretty concise. It's really to the point. It's good scholarship. So I recommend that one. But I want to talk for a moment about this new study we're going to start. This is not going to be next week. Next week we finish the Psalms. The following week we're going to pick up this book and go through it a chapter at a time. It's called God and the Pandemic by N.T. Wright. And those of you who have read N.T. Wright, he's very accessible. He's considered now by many to be the C.S. Lewis of this generation or this time frame. Really good romp through scripture on this one and theology. He just, I think, gets it right in every possible way. He's just amazing. So we'll have a nice little 5-week study. See how mercifully short this book is? 75 pages. So it's not bad. So it's just, this is decent sized print. So it took just a couple hours just to read the book, and it's a good read.
Where can we get the book?
I just downloaded mine on Kindle, but then Sally ordered a few of these. If you use Kindle and you go to Amazon, you can download it for less than $3.
Okay.
So it's on a special now, probably because it's pandemic. Leon, you're here. And sorry, I was out grandparenting most of this week, and I just got to the email. So you want Bachman time?
Yeah, I'll just say a few things.
Okay.
Thanks. What have you talked about so far?
I just recommend this book, this is our next study, so it doesn't start next week. So that's all we've done. I'm just
Oh, okay.
filling up some time waiting for you, because I know the service just ended.
It just ended, yes. So, let's see. I think, how should we start? Actually, let's start with,
Yes, good. I know.
type that in there. So it goes,
Isn't it easier just put in the title?
because then you'll get the right place. You'll get the right one. So, oops. So you just go up here. Like that.
So since we're late, we really do need to get to that 10 minutes. So maybe
Yeah,
just do
that makes
one
sense.
song or something.
I'm gonna kind of jump around and cut things off so that there are not too many things.
I'll take care of that. I'll skip it.
Okay.
Go ahead and get started.
All right, good morning, you guys.
Sorry, Frank, we got breakfast in the kitchen and still looking at, now related
They're
available. No charge.
Welcome and good morning. We had an exciting service earlier on, from the old prayer book, 1892, and so I talked about old music too, maybe like 500 years old instead. And last time we talked about the Psalter, how the Reformed Church really believed in presenting the Word of God in God's Word, right? And then singing it. The problem is when you sing it, it has to be a poem in the language of singing, and that's called versification. And so then we got the psalm tunes. So one of the psalms that we're studying today, we find in our hymnal in two places, actually. And this is from the Scottish Psalter, Psalm 124. So I wanted you to hear what it would be like if you were in a Scottish church, which is related to ours, and also how you might study this this text by just listening to it. So let's just hear a little of this psalm setting. Do we know the tune? I'll stop it there. So, how do I get this page down? So, it's interesting, the Scottish festival. So then what I did is I pulled out the Moravian Book of Worship. Then we have a Moravian. Okay, so, and what they did is they versified it as well, Psalm 124. So have you looked at Psalm 124 before? It's basically like, God saved us this time.
Yeah.
Thank God. You know, that's basically what it is. So I'm going to read the words. I would normally bring it on the overhead for you, but because things ran late and blah, blah, blah. So I'll just read you how they take the words of the Bible and try to keep it as faithful as they can, but make it rhyming. Also, make sure that they don't have all 25 verses. You know, you get a little tired after 15 or so, right? So they got it down to 3. And that is an interesting process, isn't it? Because what did they pick, right? Okay, so our Lamb has conquered. Let us follow him. With eagerness of hearts and strength of limb. Oh, let me do this. Let me find the other one. I'll do this. This will be better. Okay. Now, Israel may say, and that is in truth, if that the Lord had not been, it's so hard to read because I haven't put it on the screen. Had the Lord not our right maintained, if that Lord had not been remained, those men, See what I mean? Against us rose to strive, we surely would have been swallowed up alive. Then the second one. Yea, when their wrath against the fierce rose, the swelling, the wave, the raging scream, and became our grave, the flood, the blah, blah, blah. This is typical of hymnody, actually, is that you'll have a positive statement, and about 2/3 of the way down, it'll have a negative statement, and then it'll say, well, we're sure glad it didn't turn out that way. Remember the thing we said at the beginning? And then we do it again. Okay, so that was the second verse. And then the third verse, blessed be the Lord, who made us not their prey, and we escaped their snare, and so forth. So this is a summarization of the psalm in just 3 lines. Isn't that interesting? Right? So if I could read this, I would sing something. Now Israel may say then that in truth, if that as Lord hath, let's see, not our right maintained, if, you see how that works. And we would sing it to a tune that's familiar. This tune is called Psalm 124.
Wonder why they came up with that.
Yeah. And Psalm 124 is from the Geneva Psalter. Do people remember me talking about that? Geneva Psalter's from Geneva. It's from Switzerland. But we see how the Swiss psalm practices under Calvin make its way up into Scotland, right? Go into England, go into the Presbyterian Church, Methodist Church, so forth, and all the way here. This is very interesting. So that was one thing. Then I wanted to go to the other one. And this is going to be pretty quick, I think. Wow, that was something.
Yeah, wow. I don't know how to come up like that.
All right, why don't you take care of that line? Okay, now quickly moving on to Bach. This is such an important psalm. It's been set musically by many people. It was set twice by Bach, but it's known by a Lutheran tune because what Luther and the other people in that tradition did is they took the words that were in Latin or some other language and made it into German, right? They versified it, kind of the same thing as the Psalms, right? But unlike the psalmody, they have a little more freedom to kind of create a text of their own, right? And that's one of the big differences between a hymn and a psalm, right? The hymn is written by the hymn writer, right? So this is the cantata number 14. So Bach had church services that were 4 hours long. Okay, and it had about an hour of music. I mean, it had an hour-long sermon, and it had about an hour of music or more. And this cantata is, I think, 14 minutes long, maybe a little longer. And it sounds like opera, basically, because that was a popular style at the time. Has choral works in it and stuff like that, and he reflects upon the text of this as well. I wish I weren't so rushed. So what I'm going to do here, how do I enter the, here we go, let's do it up. So his job was to take the reading of the day from the Psalms and expound upon it musically, interpret it musically, bring the listener, the congregation into the emotional state to hear those words to the singers, and then hear the words read, and then a sermon for an hour, right, on this text. So let's go to this translation here. So what I want to show you is that what you can read in a couple minutes now becomes divided up and read by Bach. The first movement is, if God were not with us at this time, and this is a hymn tune, German Lutheran hymn tune. Boy, it would have been really bad. Okay, that's the first thing. You can imagine how you would set that musically. And then the second one is an aria. That means that the singer will go, oh, how do I feel about this? oh, and just think about one feeling for like 5 minutes, right? Okay, that's called an aria. And so it says, the tenor says, indeed, if God had allowed it, we would no longer be alive. This wrathful thing, oh no, oh no. And think about it. And of course, during music, you'll have the part where he thinks this, and then he thinks, ah, and then he goes back, just like opera. And then the last part, the next part is the aria, the bass, is now, you see this off position where it says, well, God, by your mighty protection, we are free from enemies. You see, that's the opposite, isn't it? So the bass is now having his reflection upon it. Ah. And then finally, at the end, then you have everybody say, thanks to God that we're all right. And that's the hymn. And that hymn at the end is sang in 4 parts. It has the hymn tune that everybody in the church knows. And what do they do when they know it? They sing with the choir and the orchestra. Isn't that a beautiful design? So the music itself is a sermon. It's a reading of this psalm. And so what I want to do is just pick out parts of it so you can just hear how he's expressing this. This is the opening chorus of, oh crap, this could have happened. This bad stuff could have happened to us. Can you hear it stress? It's a little nervous and fast and stuff like that, right? It happened. What happened? You know? And it's like a crowd talking, like, oh my gosh, can you believe this? And kind of stuff. Okay, now I'm going to skip to the next part real fast here. I'm almost done. Okay, so now you remember, here's the aria. Oops. Oh, that's the beginning. This is wrong. T equals. I don't know why I did that. I'll just find it.
You can also find your soulmate on here.
Wow, all at the same time.
Yeah.
Thank God saved me.
If the Lord had not been on our side, He would have found her as our soulmate.
Okay. So you can hear a lot of times what happens, like some other instrument will be like talking at the same time. Sometimes the aria will be a soul talking, and Jesus will be talking this instrument, and there's all sorts of creative things that are going on that if you understand the text, you just find lovely. So that's that one. I'm not sure where we're in that part, but because I'm having a little computer problem. She's still talking about it. Okay. Oh my gosh, this stuff could have happened to you. All right. So this is him saying, this could happen, and then he's going to say, well, we're okay. Oops. So that's the oboe part, and then... Okay, so now he's secure in the protection of God. He says, we're protected by God, we got through this thing, we're so confident in Him, blah, 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 and this is what the bass is saying. And to us, it sounds like snooty opera music, but to them, this was the pop music of the day. And they were pretty happy to go hear this instead of working on the fields 18 hours a day, right? They got to sit there and listen to Bachwort. Can you imagine that? And then hear sermons like that, and this is like the cultural center of the city, and you're hearing this gorgeous music with orchestras like that. You know, like your favorite rock band comes every Sunday. Isn't that amazing? So this is the bass expressing things. He says we're confident in God, and so after we've concluded this drama of what could have happened, God saved us, and now we get to celebrate by singing the hymn tune at the end. It's a super long aria. This is the hymn tune. It's a very stressful one because it starts off with the text, of course, this happened to us, and then moves through the text. But the congregation would have known it quite well, and they would have joined in singing it at the end.
Great, thanks.
So there you got to hear a Bach cantata of 15 minutes in about 3.
All right, thanks a lot,
Okay.
Leah.
All right, see you guys later. I'm going to go rehearse with the choir.
Thanks.
Sure.
Rest.
Okay. Well, we are, as you know, going through Psalm 124 today. And I already did a little bit of an introduction on a book, Layman's Commentary. Not next week, but the week following, we're going to start God in the Pandemic. So that will be our next book study. That's going to last for 5 weeks. Great little book. You can download it on Kindle for less than $3 if you go to Amazon. Yep, N.T. Wright, or you can buy the book. I think it was, well, Sally ordered a few copies. It was less than $10. But the Kindle version, what a deal, huh? Okay, so we are in the Psalms of Ascent. When we get to Psalm 120 all the way through to, I think it's 135, there are 15 Psalms that are called Psalms of Ascent. And they're not really sure how they got that title or what they were used for liturgically. But there's a few ideas. One was that there were 15 steps to go up to the temple. And if you can picture the choir, the Levites, standing on a step and singing a psalm, and then going up to the next one, singing another one. They're all really short, as we will see. So anyway, that was one of the ideas. The other one was that these were psalms that were sung by the pilgrims as they were coming from wherever they lived in what was called the diaspora. And the diaspora is the spreading out of all the seed. So it was after the exile, well, it was the exile, all these Jewish communities established in all the major places in that known world around the Mediterranean. And so they would come back, if they could, to come back to the temple when it was rebuilt. So they thought, well, okay, when they start coming up to the vision of the temple in the mountains, as they are climbing, that they might be singing these psalms too. But the main thing is that these psalms put Jerusalem with the temple at the very heart of Jewish worship. And that's a little bit hard for us to grasp hold of. You'll see some of that in the next service, for those of you who are going to the 10:30 service, that in the previous hymnals and in the hymns, there was so much about Jerusalem. And again, it's kind of hard for us as Christians to access that with that same level of intensity that they had. It's pretty much impossible for us to enter into that culture to the point where we can see what they experience in the temple. In fact, N.T. Wright's dissertation, and then he turned it into a 2-volume book set for us to read. His basic thing was that when Jesus came, Jesus took all that was symbolized in the temple and brought it to himself. And so he even talks about, at the beginning of each gospel, we are out in the desert. We don't have John the Baptist and Jesus in Jerusalem doing all these things. They're out in the desert. So this is a movement that calls people out and starts to change everything about Jerusalem and the temple and accrue it to Jesus. So, Psalm 124. Can anybody see it to read it? How about for the first column? Nancy, can you see the one?
If it had not been the Lord who was on our side, let Israel now say, if it had not been the Lord who was on our side when our enemies attacked us, then they would have swallowed us alive. Where their anger was kindled against us, then the flood would have swept us away. The torrent would have gone over us, and over us would have gone the raging waters. You want me to finish it, or?
Can anybody else see the? Okay, Glenn.
Blessed be the Lord who has not given us as prey to their teeth. We have escaped like a bird from the snare of the fowlers. The snare is broken, and we have escaped. Our help is in the name of the Lord, who made heaven and earth.
Okay, so you can kind of get this picture that Leon was painting for us musically, that we have the beginning of it, this troublesome thing that's happening, and we'll get into that just a little bit. There's all kinds of metaphors that this psalmist is mixing for us, and we'll get into that just a tad. But they're talking about something that could have been catastrophic but wasn't, and they attribute that the way that they escaped this catastrophe was that the Lord was on their side. So, one way to look at Psalm 124 is to see it as a cluster of Psalms 122, 123, and 124. And I'll just put up on this board this movement that Brueggemann has talked about in some of the writings he does on the Psalms. And he has 3 stages. We have Psalms of orientation, and these lean on the Torah. If you follow the Torah, everything's going to be cool with it. Look at creation, God's in control, everything's going to be good. If we just stick with these things of honoring God, worshiping the true God, and taking care of each other, we're going to be good. But it didn't work out that way, did it? So then there are Psalms of disorientation. And Jerusalem got sacked so many times and destroyed, and it was just a mess. And the people kept coming back to, but we kept the covenant, God. Why weren't you keeping your end of the bargain? And they get really angry about this with God. They argue with God. They put it to psalmody, and they express, we don't get it. Why are we experiencing this so many times? When you are the God of gods, we thought you were on our side. What's gone wrong? So during disorientation, they start to get some clues. And then when the prophets come in, the prophets start reminding them, hey, you didn't do this that well. Because you kept missing out on who the true God is. And they look at it not as individuals, but as a whole nation. The whole nation was not worshiping God. They had all these little places where they worshiped other gods and practiced some things that weren't good. But the main thing that they picked up in these prophets was that Israel was not taking care of the poor. They were not treating other people well and loving their neighbor. So we have disorientation, and then we have the rebuilding. And he calls these Psalms of reorientation. So orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. And we pick this up in this movement of Psalms 122 through 124, where we have something that looks like this in small scale. And we have Psalm 122 saying, let's go on a journey. Let's have this wonderful time together. God's going to watch over us. We're going to be good. But then they get attacked by someone. And during this attack, they begin to realize, wow, this is really, really bad. We could lose everything right now. But then there's an intervention. And there's this Psalm 124, picks up this hymn of praise of God's intervention in their lives and on this journey. So we don't know much about particulars of this attack or this near catastrophe that happened. And we don't really need to know the specifics, do we? Because it could happen anytime, and it could happen in our lives at any time. We could be motoring along thinking everything's great between us and God, we're doing all fine, and then the bottom just falls right out. And then we go scrambling to find meaning in that. And we go through probably, the stages of grief, some would say, until we finally get to acceptance. And then we can look back and say, oh, that's where God was. So it's the plot line for our lives, it's the plot line for much of Israel's history, and it's probably the plot line for the Christian church too. We go through times where we are disoriented, and then we find out something new. I mentioned that the psalmist used many metaphors. How many metaphors can you see in Psalm 124? Anybody got it there in your, and by metaphor, whenever he says it was like this, like that. Let's see if we can get back to it. Okay. So he says, if it had not been the Lord who was on our side, let Israel now say, if it had not been the Lord who was on our side when our enemies attacked us. And the word that he uses actually in the Hebrew is Adam. So it means, what is Adam? It means man, yeah. So it wasn't a word for nations attacking. So it's probably not when they were attacked by all the major empires of the day. But it was probably someone else inside the camp who was sabotaging them, or a smaller group. But it was Adam rather than nations attacked us. Then we would have been swallowed up alive. When their anger was kindled against us, then we have the flood. Flood's one of the metaphors. Floods and mighty waters are a strong image for Israel. They did not like to sail. They did not like going out on the Mediterranean in boats. They let other nations take care of that for them. They went as passengers, and that was about as close to that as they wanted to be. They were so afraid of the water because it was a place that they thought, maybe God's not in control here of these floodwaters. And so we have a very famous story of Jesus in these mighty waters. And he's in a storm, you remember the story, and he's asleep in the back of the boat. And then his disciples wake him up, and he says, what did he say? Peace, be still. That's a strong statement of Jesus is God, because only God could do that. So in the New Testament, they pick up this flood or this mighty waters imagery that goes all through the Old Testament and is strong in the Gospels to show us that Jesus is God. Then the flood would have swept us away. The torrent would have gone over us. Then over us would have gone the raging waters. Blessed be the Lord, who has not given us as prey to their teeth. So he switches the metaphor there. We're no longer in the waters. Maybe it was a Leviathan. Maybe it was some really big, like Jonah being swallowed by the whale, or whatever was out there that they were afraid of, this mighty monster that was going to eat them. And then we switch again. We're not even in the midst of, we're not even being attacked by this mighty monster with big teeth. Now we have escaped like a bird from the snare of the fowler. So now we're a little bird that's escaping. The snare is broken and we have escaped. And then the conclusion, our help is in the name of the Lord who made heaven and earth. So the bottom line to this psalm is this. It was a conclusion to a war story. Now, some of you have served in the military, and so you've been around, probably most of you have been around soldiers before, and there's a formula that we always use for our war stories. I'm replacing one of the words, just for polite company. So it's like, no kidding, there we were. And you can replace kidding with a word that might fit. But no kidding, there we were. We would have died, except this thing happened. Something happened that saved us. That's what this psalm is. It's a conclusion to a war story where it's no kidding. There we were getting attacked. We were just getting beat badly, and mix in all the metaphors that you want to with that to show that this was we almost lost everything, right? This was worse than anything we've ever been through, except that something came and intervened and saved us. And in this case, for Israel, that something that intervenes is always Yahweh. So Yahweh, the covenant God for Israel, comes at that last moment. And that seems to be the message of our lives too, right? When you pray, has God ever been early in a response to your prayer? It's like he never misses an opportunity to be a little bit late. It's like Jesus going to Lazarus to raise him from the tomb. Was he on time? He was 3 days late. And Lazarus had been rotting in there. So it's a refrain in our lives that rings true in Scripture. That God just is doing something by making us wait. What do you think God's doing when he makes us wait?
Building trust.
Building trust, yep. Building trust and helping us to become patient, right? So
Reminding us that we need him.
yes. And reminding us that he's not something that we can just put in the quarter and pull out of the vending machine. It's not that one-to-one exchange. There's something different about God. That God is sovereign. And that means that nothing controls God. And we have to use something in our mind to think, this God is not someone who's there to serve me like Santa Claus. This God is powerful and is somewhat dangerous and unpredictable. So in the Chronicles of Narnia, how is Jesus portrayed? A lion. Scary as can be. Aslan, the lion. So that kind of, he pulls on that imagery. That this God of the covenant is not someone who's at our beck and call. But he will always come before it's too late. How are we doing for time? Okay, we're good. All right. So do any of you have war stories where God intervened at the last minute and saved you from catastrophe? Anybody? Crystal, you're nodding your head. Are you thinking of
I
this?
was thinking about with my mother,
Uh-huh.
the one thing I was her caregiver, and I really did not want to have to do was put her into a nursing home. And I really fought it to the end. But eventually had to do it, and then found out that, I picked a good place to put her in. Let's just say some things happened, and they were going to evict her.
Oh.
And, it was just a really bad situation, and I was scrambling. Nobody wanted to take her.
Uh-huh.
And we got down to the wire. I mean, it was like, yes, you have to move her to another place. And the only place that would take her was not a good situation at all. And I was just heart sick.
Yeah.
And we got there. We were supposed to go early in the morning and check her out of there and get her transferred over to this other place. And I was just absolutely, like I said, just, oh my gosh. We got there, went and sat down, and the social worker came up to me and she said, Crystal, not to mention the name, didn't they call you? And I was like, no. And she said, they won't take your mother. And I said, what are we going to do, Elizabeth? No, I didn't say that. Actually, I said, Elizabeth, she's got to stay here. And she said, Crystal, and then she smiled, she said, we do have a room, there's nobody in it, so we'll just keep her here for now and see what happens.
Right. Well.
And when I got up with my brothers as we were walking out, they said, well, what are we gonna do? And I said, we don't have to do anything. I said, God has it, she's fine, she'll stay here. And they were like, Crystal, she didn't say that. I said, I don't care what you're saying or what you're thinking. I said, I know. God meant for her to be here, to stay there, and they did.
Hey, great. Well, good story. Yeah.
Yep.
That would fit very well with she's in the journey. There's this disruption, and then last minute the saving.
Yep.
And then there are probably many of us, if we were to sit back and think, we would identify some times in our lives when that did happen to us. But then we would also say, but there are some other times when it didn't happen. When the person died or something happened that we didn't want and we still don't like it. That's where it becomes a little bit trickier. So in the Old Testament, there's hardly any mention of an afterlife, right? There's just not much that's mentioned. In the New Testament, there's so much about the resurrection and the afterlife. We have to actually go to the Apocrypha, and those are those books of the Bible that we have, but not all churches have, that we put in there. It's called the intertestamental period, between when Malachi was finished and Matthew or Mark began. So we've got this hundreds of years, several centuries in there, where Israel was under Greek rule, and before that, even with the Assyrians, the Persians. So during that time, there were books that were written that were trying to solve this problem, that it didn't seem that God had showed up. So how did they solve the problem? They wrote about the resurrection. So that for us, for them, God doesn't show up sometimes, and people do die, and nations go away, and things happen, institutions pass away. But in the resurrection, that's when everything will be rewritten. Everything will be resolved. It's a real struggle for us as 21st century Christians to realize that our lives are not going to end with everything being completed. It's just not going to happen, that everything gets put into place in our lifetime. If we join with the Christians of previous eras, we will say, and that's fine, because there is a time that we know by faith where God shows up and resolves everything. So we're allowed to have this time of frustration, but we do our frustration by faith, knowing that God is going to right all the wrongs. That's what the justice part of the judgment is going to be in the resurrection, is God righting all the wrongs. One thing, we'll just finish with this problem. One thing about the Psalms is that we have to get used to this whole idea that there are a lot of enemies out there, right? The Psalms are just loaded with enemies. And this Psalm only touches or alludes to the enemies, and then within all those metaphors. So I've selected the worst of the Psalms for enemies. These are a whole genre of themselves. They're called imprecatory Psalms, where the psalmist is just calling down fire from heaven on these people who are their enemies. So Psalm 137 is that beautiful psalm. It starts out just gorgeously. By the waters of Babylon, we lay down our harps, and our enemies told us, sing a song of Zion. And anyway, they go on about that. It's a rather sad, melancholy thing. And then at the end, the psalmist says, daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. Whoa. Wow. You know, that never will show up in our worship services. Those two verses are always left out of everything that we do in church. It's just like, yeah, this is awful. Dash your infants against the rocks.
It's even left out of the daily lectionary.
Yeah, you got to go looking for this. But it is there, and it's part of the faith of Israel. And I think it's a reason why we need to look at the Psalms in total without the edited versions, because it tells us something important about God's relationship to the chosen people, Israel. And we're going to just look at this problem. The New Covenant, or New Testament, had a whole different view of enemies. It was not about dash their little ones against the rocks. In the Lord's Prayer, it's forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sinned against us. In the Sermon on the Plain, which is in Luke, But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. And it goes on. And then Paul picks up the same. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. It's a whole different flavor, isn't it, of how we approach our enemies. I want to suggest to you, though, that there's something important about the way the psalmists actually got into their anger and really shook their fists and, this is not the way it should be. We should have a judgment. So Eugene Peterson, in his really nice little book, Answering God, the Psalms as Tools for Prayer, he has this to say about the angry flavor to the Psalms. Psalm prayer enters into the way things are, but finds that the way things are is pretty bad. The Psalms are full of unsettling enemy talk. God is the primary subject in the Psalms, but enemies are established in solid second place. Hate, and he goes on to explain what's good about it. The main thing I just want to summarize for him is that we do have anger and hate. And as Christians, because we've been told don't have that, it doesn't mean the hate and the anger goes away. It just means it gets repressed. And it comes out in other ways that we're often surprised that we have that capacity for. Even some of us who have got pretty mild personalities, more like a golden retriever, it's always a shock when a golden retriever bites somebody, right? But it happens. And so those of us who are golden retrievers, we know, we've got times we can look back when the anger just bubbled up and took over. The psalmists put it to God. They took that anger, they admitted it, their hatred towards their enemies, and they put it before God. And God can then transform it into something that's so much more wonderful that fits with the new covenant. So Timothy Keller, in his book, The Songs of Jesus, says the psalmist could not see what we see. God is ever on our side because in Christ our sins can't bring us into condemnation. So not trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword. And he goes on, he mentions all these things that are our enemies. And the key to this, I think, is that we have enemies. We get confused when we think those enemies are people. People are pawns being used by a greater force. Our enemies are not the people. The enemies are the forces of evil that use people to act out as a proxy war, if you will. And I'll just give you the real quick cosmology of the Bible. We have God in heaven, and there's a war, right, between God and Satan. And then it drops down to earth, where it gets played out on earth as the devil has been cast down to the earth. And it's taken up by these proxies. God's proxy is Israel. The devil's proxies are all the other nations when we're looking at the Old Testament. And then it goes into our very hearts. That's the third layer, where there's a battle within us between good and evil. That's the three-layer cosmology that is behind the Bible. It is this war. It's called an apocalyptic cosmology. There's a war in heaven. It takes place on the earth among the nations, and it's a war within our heart. So we can pick up on all that and realize the people who are doing these proxy wars are not the ones we need to focus on as our enemies. It's this greater force of evil. So, conclusion, human hate is not a very promising first step to the establishment of righteousness. Nevertheless, when prayed, they are first steps into the presence of God, where we learn He has ways of dealing with what we bring Him that are both better or other and better than what we had in mind. But until we are in prayer, we are not teachable. It is better to pray badly than not to pray at all. A ship that is dead in the water cannot be steered. So the call to honesty in prayer and taking it to God is what we find in the Psalms that I think is the most important spirituality and theology that we can get out of the Psalms. Next week is our last week in the Psalms, and we will do Psalm 26. So I need to go get dressed and get ready for a service of 1892. good, thanks. And bye, everybody on Zoom. Hope you were able to hear that somewhat.
Yes, bye. Thank you.
Good, okay,
Yes,
bye.
thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.